Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week and Ethena. I'm Ian Scher, the editor-in-chief of Compliance Week, and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is Slow Vendors, Changing Risks, and the Compliance Customization Gap. Before we hear from our presenters, I'm going to go through the agenda quickly with you. We're scheduled to go for an hour. After the presentation, we're going to have question and answer session, but during the presentation as well, feel free to ask questions. They will be anonymous. Please don't be shy. You can ask questions at any time using the Ask a Question function. It's on the left-hand side of your screen, and we will get to them as much as we can. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This webcast also offers CPE credits for all attendees. Please use Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser and disable your pop-ups to ensure that you have access to the exam. Disable your pop-up blockers. Allow pop-ups. Got to be careful about that. Once I have signed off the webcast completely, the final examination will start, and it'll be in a separate window. If you have any questions, webcasts@complianceweek.com. That's webcasts@complianceweek.com. Finally, don't forget that you can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left side of your screen. And there's also a feedback form, and we will have a recording of this as well. Okay, so now we are going to start with our presenters. We've got Roxanne Petraeus. Roxanne is the CEO and co-founder of Ethena. After graduating from Harvard's Reserve Officer Training Program, she was commissioned into the U.S. Army. She served on a combat deployment in Afghanistan and in training missions in Cambodia and Mongolia. After leaving the military, she worked at McKinsey & Company and as a consultant before founding Ethena. I also want to introduce Susan Divers, an advisor at Ethena. Susan brings expertise in compliance, formerly serving more than 8 years as Director of Thought Leadership at LRN, where she helped implement innovative and effective compliance programs. She also was Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at AECOM and served at Lockheed Martin and SAIC. It's great to have you with us, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne and Susan.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ian.
Wonderful. All right. So figured we'd start with just a bit of an introduction as to Ethena, who we are, and then we're going to dive into some insights from a survey that we did with about 150 compliance professionals and what those insights told us about some of the challenges that folks face with their existing vendors. Susan's going to be providing some really helpful insights all along the way, but in particular around why now is an especially important time to have an agile vendor, given all of the changes in the compliance landscape. And we'll be also sharing some of the neat ways that our customers are using Ethena to respond to the very fast-moving landscape that you all are operating in today. Susan and I are especially friendly and love to chat, so please do put questions in throughout. You don't have to wait for the end Q&A. We love hearing either questions you have or insights from your own perspectives, as I think that makes the discussion much more rich. Susan, anything to add before I dive in?
No, but just to thank Ian and you, Roxanne, for the chance to participate in this. Having worked a long time in the ethics and compliance space, I see certain cycles that play out over time, and the debate about to customize or not to customize is one of them. So kudos to everyone for putting that up as a key topic.
Agree. And I think that the AI tools that are now available that Ethena has been making heavy use of, I think have actually really changed a little bit of that kind of binary of do I have to make training in-house to make it effective? Can I leverage a vendor, et cetera? So also happy to kind of share some of the AI learnings that we've been seeing as we heavily use it ourselves in our product. So in terms of who Ethena is, and maybe even a bit of backstory, unlike Susan, I'm not a former chief ethics and compliance officer. Instead, I was in the Army, and I found that we did an excessive amount in my eyes of training, but unfortunately, a lot of it just wasn't effective in the compliance space. So everything from sexual harassment to cybersecurity. And part of the reason it didn't feel very effective is the Army, like I'm sure many of the organizations that you all run, is huge. You might be an engineer and your experience is entirely different than an infantryman, which is entirely different than someone who's essentially in HR. But typically everyone got the same training. And that is something I've noticed can be very common, especially at large organizations, is kind of a one size fits all. We sometimes call it like a peanut butter approach where you spread it wide, but it's really the same thickness throughout the org. And I think something that's been very exciting about micro learning, so these, putting everything into shorter bits, is you can be heavily targeted and build your own courses, not just for your company, but for all the different parts within your company. So the sales team essentially having their sort of own version of compliance training that very specifically addresses their risks. And that training might look really different than, say a G&A or ops function. Susan, anything to add on this concept?
Yeah, Roxanne. I think one of the really interesting things for me is that we were doing research when I was at LRN on how people felt about training and whether their program was effective. And one of the maybe only good things to come out of the pandemic was that the focus shifted then to making training more employee friendly. Instead of just focusing on pushing tons of content out the door, like with a shovel, it became much more a question of tailoring, as you've just talked about, and really trying to meet people's needs and meet them where they are. Somebody working on a factory floor doesn't really want to know what section of the US code this relates to. Trust me. So I think this is part of a good trend that we're seeing right now.
And that's a perfect segue into the idea of both customizable, so making training that is incredibly easy for you all to tweak, happy to glad, perhaps to change something more substantial as it pertains to a regulation or a change in your business, something Susan will get to, as well as fully custom content. So in one of these pictures, you can see we have a studio where we create from scratch content for our customers who need something very bespoke, because even though the AI content creation tools have gotten very good, they're still not necessarily the high bar of quality that I think maybe a very discerning employee might be looking for. Susan, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit. You've done a lot of great thought leadership on the ECCP, and just like when we say effective, like what does that really mean when it comes to training? Because I think that, is sort of the why behind why training should be so customizable.
I agree with you, Roxanne. And the ECCP, I'm sure everybody on the call knows, but it's the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. When I looked this morning, it was still in force. And in recent years, it's focused more on training, and it's gotten more specific, which I think is good, because prosecutors at DOJ see a lot of programs, and sometimes they see bad programs, but I think a lot of times they see good programs that have still had a breakdown. And so their insights are really valuable. And this is one of their insights, which I think was in the 2024 April guidance revisions that came out, that really you need to customize your training and take sanitized examples from real life or near misses that you've had. And that's all part of making it relevant. And that in turn makes it more effective. You're not just rolling out the same stale content that you've been rolling out for years before, or the same sort of talking PowerPoints, which bore everybody as well.
And one thing we learned, we did a great talk with one of our customers, Clavio, at Boston's Compliance Week conference a couple weeks back. And I see it as really common that customers will embed, for example, a message from leadership. So you can kind of see that here in our training to kick off, for example, code of conduct. But this particular customer went a step further, and I thought that what he did was really clever. So he went around to all the senior business functions. So think like, head of sales, head of engineering, et cetera. And he actually had those leaders appear in the code of conduct topics that were most relevant to their function. So for example, the head of sales, I think, sort of talked about like side letters and, sort of that section of the code of conduct. Whereas I think that head of HR, the people leader, talk to more of their like inclusion and belonging section, et cetera. But it was this, he said it was incredibly well received because, maybe if you're an incredibly large organization, not everyone sort of has some sort of personal relationship with the CEO per se, but most employees are sort of very aware of their, call it tribe, their functions leadership. And so to see, again, the head of sales, or the head of the, LA office or whatever it was in their training, just like made it go even one step further into saying this was very much designed for you. So I thought that was it was a unique spin on really putting that company's thumbprint on their training versus just kind of grabbing something off the shelf.
Roxanne, if I can add one thing there,
Please.
This has been a sore point for as long as I've been in this space, which I admit to being a high mileage car. And I've seen this now for at least 20 years where people struggle to customize because on the one hand, if you develop everything in-house, it's an incredible lift and it's hard to stay abreast of all the topics. It's hard to have good quality video. It's hard to have vignettes and all the things that Ethena does so brilliantly. But if you buy it off the shelf, a lot of times it's like stale pancakes. They taste good on Sunday, but not during the rest of the week. Sorry, I love those analogies. So, do you do it in-house or do you go out and outsource it? And I think that whole debate has finally resolved itself with the advent of AI, with companies like ours that say, we can make this really easy. This doesn't need to be a big deal. And I know we'll get into some of the research on that in a minute.
I love that. And as someone who made pancakes on Sunday and looked at the leftovers and asked, should I put them in Tupperware? And I decided against it. I feel very validated by my decision. So thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. So here's just a very tactical way that, one of many that you can use to make training more effective. And by effective here, we mean more specific to someone's role, function, geography, et cetera. And that is that you can either allow learners to select demographics. So for example, I'm a people manager or I'm not. I work in retail, I work in manufacturing, I work in the corporate office, et cetera. Or you can manually assign those tracks, usually via data from your HRIS. And I know that sounds kind of incredibly simple in this like age of AI, this is not necessarily a technological breakthrough. However, something I've come to appreciate, now many years into running this company, is that sometimes the operational realities are what keep a compliance leader from doing the training they really want to be doing. So they want to do all the things Susan said of like make it highly relevant, update vignettes based on what they saw in the hotline and their sort of speak up culture from the previous 6 months. But they kind of say like, look, I can't even get clean data for who's a manager and who isn't, let alone, anything more granular than that. So how could I possibly run a tailored program if I can't even sort of do the basics required for tailoring? And so I think some of these, kind of clever solutions, whether it's getting around PII issues with SCORM files, or whether it is either pulling data from your system of record or having the employee select, depending on which you think will be more accurate, are ways that we found we can kind of take someone from almost a survive state of, hey, I'm just trying to push out annual training and get to 90% plus completion every year, to more of a thrive state of I'm doing all of the ECCP guidance. I'm really kind of making this training program reflect not just, sort of what I strictly must do, but instead what I really want to communicate to the company. Susan, anything here?
Well, I have a great example to share, Roxanne. A couple of years ago, we were working with one of the really big drugstore chains, which probably if you look out your window in Brooklyn, you might even see one. But anyway, their new head of employee relations was on the call. And she said that part of the training mandatory training she had been told she needed to take when she onboarded was how to dispose of medical waste in a pharmacy. And, maybe that's good to know, but it certainly wasn't relevant to her new job or to the sort of skill set she needed. And, the more you do that, unfortunately, the more people get turned off by training and really don't want to do it.
I think that's right. And something we'll get to is combating training fatigue and how that has been a consistent theme, both in my conversations with customers and in the compliance survey that we ran. And I think that actually targeted training kind of has two benefits. One is it's what the DOJ is sort of saying is best practice. But the second is usually it cuts down on training time, which might make your senior leaders happy, might make your junior employees happy, probably makes you happy because you're getting less complaints, et cetera. What I'll do now is turn to the state of compliance in 2025. So what we're going to see next are the kind of key results, and we have the full survey available. I'm sure we'll be sending it out after this, but we pulled some of the key insights from the survey. And again, this was about 150 compliance professionals taken early this year. So I would say this is, quite, has not yet gone stale like the Sunday pancakes. So I thought this was really interesting. So 66% of the respondents, many who may be on this call right now, said that their either current process of training is being created in-house or their vendor would take a week or more to make changes. And 32% said it was really multiple weeks. And we're going to get to, we have a great slide where Susan is going to go over some of the more recent changes. Some of them were quite dramatic in the compliance landscape. But what I took from this, and curious, Susan, your kind of perspective is that, it's pretty unacceptable in like the age of AI and how good tech has gotten to have such long turnaround times as the standard for customizing training. I think that just really can put customers in a bind. And so that's why we now have the ability to do red lines yourself. So you can take our content and change happy to glad same day, or working with our CS team to do it very quickly, because multiple weeks might mean, something pretty significant has changed in the company, but you're not yet able to reflect it in the training.
Roxanne, one of the things that sort of dismays me about this slide is that was exactly the same kind of problem I had when I was the chief ethics officer at AECOM. I remember that when Syria was first sanctioned, we had a number of sales teams operating, looking for opportunities to develop resorts in Syria. I mean, it turns out it wouldn't have been a good idea, but it became illegal at that point. And our vendors said it would take more than 2 weeks to really go back and change the training content on that. And we wanted to roll something out quickly, preferably a short refresher. And in those days, and that was maybe 10 years ago, there was no such thing as a short refresher on OFAC sanctions. So, hopefully, given the tools we have today, that can change, but it really needs to change.
It's a perfect example of why, even weeks might be too long based on how quickly sort of it feels like the world shifts these days. And something this particular question didn't get at, but I've definitely heard from my conversations and curious if this resonates for you, Susan, is this is for kind of tweaking, call it off-the-shelf content. What I've heard for if you are getting a vendor, an agency or a compliance training vendor to create net new, fully bespoke content for you. So more of that, I have a vision for a code of conduct training and this is going to be made fully from scratch for me. I recently heard someone tell me that process was a 6-month process, which kind of blew my mind because that is just an incredibly long time. I understand if you're making an Oscar nominated movie or something, why that might take that long, but for, what may be kind of 45 minutes of code of conduct training. And so I found that to be an especially challenging spot. And they said if they needed to make tweaks to it, then it sort of sets the whole process back, because instead of micro learnings and instead of being able to, for example, overlay AI for language translations, it was sort of all manual, all static. And so it just was, it had even longer turnaround times than this.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like using a typewriter instead of a computer.
Yes.
And that was definitely my experience. And I think even code of conduct rewrites now take about 3 months, which, again, in the days of AI and other tools and the ability to move very quickly I mean, what if your CEO leaves? You've got to reshoot all your videos, and you don't really want to wait 6 months to do that. So that's a very good point to focus on.
The typewriter analogy is a very apt one in that if any of you all are using SCORM files, there's also the ability, it's something that we typically do. We can do the old version, which is static. So it's more like a PDF that you need to download and re-upload every time you make a change. But we can also support dynamic SCORM files, which are essentially like having something in a Dropbox folder, in a Microsoft Office folder, et cetera, which means that the changes are universal as soon as you make them. And that's just another way that you can kind of save on that whole workflow and really streamline things if you elect to go the dynamic SCORM route, which is not the typewriter route.
Right. No more carbon copies.
that may have been, I don't totally remember that from the workplace, but I did have a typewriter. So yeah, that one resonates for sure. Okay. So we talked about this a bit, or we alluded to it, but in the survey, we found that perhaps no surprise. Honestly, I was kind of surprised this number wasn't even higher, because this is the number one thing that I think people bring up to me, which is 46% of respondents felt the pressure to reduce overall employee training time. So when we talked about the idea of role and risk-based learning, so like Susan's perfect example of, why does someone need medical waste disposal training if they're never in their role going to be doing that? We had one particular public company who we helped do a complete overhaul of their training and move it from the peanut butter approach to role and risk-based training. And they actually cut down on overall seat time for the average employee, 40%. And that wasn't necessarily the goal of this overhaul. The goal was to make sure that every employee was receiving relevant training. And a couple of the levers they pulled, one is doing things like only assigning deep dives to content to employees who needed it. So for example, they assessed that there was only a small percentage of their employee population who was really at risk of, significant like AML concerns. And so that's where that training went instead of to everybody. The second lever they pulled was doing shorter annual refreshers for employees who have been here for a long period of time, instead of kind of everyone taking the same content year over year. So new hires were getting longer content, but then if you'd been there for a while, you were getting a shorter refresher based on whatever kind of had been the most significant concerns the business faced in the past year. And the final lever that can be really powerful is test out. So we had Ethena offer test out, for example, and what that means is that you get to create the test, you get to decide what success is, and employees can test out of different modules based on demonstrating their learning. So maybe they're not going to get the data privacy training if they're demonstrating that they have sort of passed that with whatever you deem to be a sufficient score. And all of those levers, when put together, again, can cut down on training time by 40+%, which if you're getting that pressure to say, hey, we just have people taking way too much training and it's not effective, it's kind of this magical win-win.
Well, that's a perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Roxanne.
No, please. I was going to ask if you had anything.
Oh, I was just going to say that not only is an approach that saves money. When I was in-house, much as I liked my colleagues on the business side, every year they would tell me exactly how much time sold money was going to go to waste because of training. And so you've got two issues there. One is it does take time sold. And secondly, is it a waste? And when you're customizing training the way you just described, it's not going to be stale pancakes. It should be, and it will be, if you're customizing it and you're thinking about whether somebody's experienced or has just joined the company, you're going to give them pancakes that are relevant to their job. Sorry, I'll get off the pancakes in a minute. But it's a win-win to do it that way instead of the peanut butter approach and just one size fits all.
Definitely. And I think here to give this is sort of more something that we're thinking about for a product roadmap is you can get pretty granular already with just data from, for example, what's in your HRIS. But I think kind of a future state, maybe a couple of years out, maybe sooner, is having persona-based training. So this is where AI could be very cool. And, you know a lot about each of your employees based on everything from just their function to what tools they use within the company to everything from like your data in some of your HR investigations, like all of it. And so how they're responding to training, how they respond to surveys, like, you can get quite granular and start to create personas that are even more refined than just, Susan works in the DC office, and is in corporate. And I think that has the potential to be even more granular and specific versus a kind of generic, hey, we're just kind of talking at everybody. And then this last point, pretty simple one, but I think in service of the idea that you should be meeting employees where you're at, Susan, you talked about like the kind of post-pandemic shift, which I think is always a good one of a very design-centric and sort of employee-centric approach to compliance training. Of one goal would be to meet employees where they're at, and 31% of respondents said that training is not accessible on mobile. And, depending on your workforce, that might be a place where they're like very likely to be able to knock out some of their training. And so, could be a miss to like not have the training be very easy for them to access there.
Roxanne, in one of our annual program effectiveness reports at LRN, right after the pandemic, we highlighted examples of companies meeting the challenge of the pandemic. And this strongly reminds me about Dell, which we described, I think it was our 2020 report, where Dell moved its entire ethics and compliance training program onto a mobile app because employees were home and their kids wanted to use the computer for school, their spouse wanted to use the computer, or the bandwidth wasn't good. And so it was a big lift and they did it. And it was incredibly popular. And people, I think their completion rate, which was always very high, got even higher as a result of that because they met people where they are and they made it easy for them.
I agree. Something I see is offering training reminders via Slack, via Microsoft Teams, whatever sort of system. Like, yes, some people live in their inbox, but others don't, right? Your manufacturing, your retail, there's a bunch of different systems where that might be more accessible for folks. And so making the training also accessible via whatever systems are most common, I think can be really quite powerful. Susan, at this point, I would love to turn it over to you to kind of do a once over the world of the different compliance changes that you've seen even in this short 2025 that we have had, because I think that really hits home why having a very agile program is important. And of course, folks, if you want to ask questions of Susan that are sort of more in the vein of what she's seeing kind of more from a zoomed out strategic lens, feel free. And Susan, I'll just field any of those to you after you go over the slide.
Oh, that's great, Roxanne. Well, I'm glad I used the example of a number of years ago when Syria first went under sanction. And at AECOM, we had to react very quickly to tell people that was now prohibited. And it wasn't that easy to sort of turn the aircraft carrier at the time. But now, with some of the things that have happened, which everyone on the call I'm sure is aware of in the FCPA space, there's some talk about, it's not that big an enforcement administration and, the risk has gone down. Well, take a look at the national security space, because that's not true. The Trump administration has always really liked export controls, and they've been ramping them up. They've especially targeted AI and chip and tech. The whole NVIDIA China dialogue is influencing that. And sensitive equipment in general, and global penalties have gone up. So that's an area that's tightening. The same on the sanctions side. There's a certain kind of assumption that Russia's, off the hook, but not if you look at the cases. There are 2 in the last year where individuals and a company in the U.S. have gotten prosecuted for diverting technology and parts to Russia, which is under sanctions still. And other sensitive areas include China and the Middle East, Iran. And then, last but not least, the Trump administration has not rolled back, Biden administration rules, sorry, it's like you have to follow the thread, but on sensitive data transfers. And that is data that has biometric markers or location for you or for me or for anyone on the call. So companies that are sitting on data troves that have personal data like that are now about to be faced with very, very strong rules that take effect in May, where you have to get special licenses in order to make those transfers. And countries like China are particularly sensitive for it. So if you haven't seen the sensitive data transfer rules, I suggest that you take a look. I've just written a piece for the SCCE magazine, which is going to come out in June and includes that. And then there's a tendency in this space sometimes to say, hey, we're a startup or we're a small or mid-sized company. This isn't a big deal for us. But the new Secretary of Commerce at the annual review that they do every year made a point of calling out startups that have he called it bleeding edge technology, which I love that term, where they don't have controls and they're vulnerable to exploitation by sanctioned entities. So it's something to really think about in terms of your risk. And, to tie it back to what we've been talking about, training has to reflect today's risks, not yesterday's. And if you can customize as easily as we're telling you you can, then you're able to take your existing training and turn it around in the space of a couple of days and make it relevant and use it to alert people that there are new risks and that they need to be mitigated.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I figured maybe we'll take a bit of a detour further into kind of these changing regulatory political landscape, because I was telling Susan before the webinar started that I was just on a bit of a customer roadshow. And I feel like the most common question a customer will ask me is, what are other customers doing? Because I think compliance can be a very sort of high stakes and lonely role within a company. And so it's helpful to have the insights of your peers. And so there were a couple of topics that came up that, Susan, I'll just address one by one and please weigh in. One was AI, one was kind of call it cultural concerns, twofold, DEI being one, and then change in tone at the top, political rhetoric being another. And then so I can go through all of those and kind of say what I've been seeing, and Susan definitely weigh in. So the first one you mentioned, AI here. What I'm seeing, so Ethena rolled out an off-the-shelf AI compliance course that has been adopted very quickly, probably one of our sort of fastest launch to adoption courses, because not surprisingly, many companies are kind of figuring out what their own AI governance policies are, et cetera. And here, the thing I'm seeing the most with that training to make it effective versus kind of feeling like it's a bit of a check the box approach to AI is twofold. One is heavy customization. So Athena's own stance on what LLMs we have enterprise licenses for, what data can be put in which system, et cetera, is likely to be different than some other companies, because these are all very specific, almost policy-based things. And so really training to your own AI policies versus a generic, hey, be thoughtful when using an LLM, which is not very helpful, especially if you're perhaps new to this and don't what does be thoughtful mean? That leaves a ton of room for interpretation. So I'm seeing very heavy customization of that course to include scenarios that already have popped up. Maybe your IT team has notified you of them. And then the second one is either lockout of systems or only granting system access after having done that training. So for example, this is what we did internal to Athena, and I've seen a lot of customers do this, is we only grant you access to enterprise-wide licenses that we have after you completed Athena's own AI compliance training. And we offer a API that allows our customers to do the same thing. So if you have Okta or some sort of SSO system, which I'm sure all of you do, what you can do is essentially say, you, employee, can't have access to our, call it ChatGPT instance until you have done this training. And if you're doing an annual refresher, if they are X number of days behind deadline, you now lose access to your ChatGPT. And that's just like an added control that I think people have been very hungry for with AI in particular. I said 2 things on AI, but I remember a third that is very common, which is adding role-specific training to a couple of functions. I'm seeing it most frequently with marketing teams because they have really sophisticated AI tools, and they're also kind of perhaps most likely to violate certain issues, whether it's sort of like email spam or the content within marketing itself, and a little bit with engineering and HR being the other one because of the access to so much employee data. Susan, anything to add on the AI front?
Well, timely, Roxanne, because the new sensitive data rules do apply to AI as well. And there's specifics in there about what you can and can't send or the restrictions and the licenses that you'll need. So that's another example of why it's important to be able to customize, because your AI training today may not be adequate in May when those rules take effect.
Exactly. The second bucket is, it could be a whole webinar in itself, but it's essentially how companies are navigating 2 different kind of currents. One is the, call it DEI backlash, for lack of a more specific term. And of course, being compliance professionals, this might not be fully in your wheelhouse, but what I'm typically seeing is compliance is sort of partnering with legal and HR in a concerted effort to this. This may manifest in your code of conduct and other places. And so companies really wanting to be very thoughtful in their language. One of the most consistent things we're seeing and hearing, we ran a separate survey of companies, how they're navigating this. And one of the most common tactics was rebrand. So changing some language, but not necessarily changing most policies. And there again, it sort of manifests whether it's in your code of conduct, your sort of inclusion module, or in something like harassment prevention. And so we're seeing a lot of companies change everything from the name of DEI training itself to the language that they use, seeing a lot of shifts to things like belonging, an emphasis on merit-based hiring. And that, of course, is triggering a lot of companies to make sure that their training aligns with what their sort of leadership stance is on this. Susan, anything to add in that bucket?
The only thing I would add, Roxanne, is just a perspective on it that as with a lot of regulations, they can shift and change with different administrations. And, it puts the challenge to the compliance team and the legal team to say, okay, what can we do? What must we do here, but still remain consistent with our codes of conduct? And I keep coming back to the point that no one's out there amending their codes of conduct to take DEI out, I would bet you. So, it's an ongoing process, and only time will tell where it ends.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who kind of started this company in part with the idea of, I think really good training can enforce a culture of inclusion. Having been a woman in the Army has sort of really opened my eyes to like the challenges you can have if an organization like isn't inclusive. I think I have been very heartened by companies being very thoughtful about thoughtful and deliberate about, again, for sort of using loose terms, not a massive pendulum shift in another direction, but instead saying like, maybe we don't want to fight the battle of this particular term, but we are absolutely committed to the same kind of ethos that we were a year ago. And therefore, sort of oddly, it makes it more of a semantic exercise. And so that's where I'm seeing, I think, a lot of the rebrand versus realignment. I think that to my personal values is heartening, that it's not a shift into saying like, you know what, we're actually going to look for a homogenous culture that is exclusionary.
Hopefully. And again, that's still remaining true to your code of conduct.
That's right. And then the last thing, and this has come up, Athena runs some closed door compliance roundtables, 12 to 15 compliance leaders, and we bring in experts and just kind of have a closed door discussion so folks can talk with their peers. And one of the things that's come up very frequently in those settings has been this feeling of, hey, I'm worried that employees may be interpreting the news, in what they read in the news as an indication that that like more, for lack of a better term, bad behavior is acceptable. So, someone who's not a compliance professional, not a legal professional, might read, FCPA enforcement has been paused as bribery is okay. Or they might, sort of like, again, read into the news and think that conflicts of interest are okay, that, insider trading is like not a focus, and they may interpret that as therefore it's fine. And so I've heard a lot of compliance professionals kind of say privately, hey, I'm actually especially concerned that the tone at, call it the political level, might indicate that compliance is like not a priority, that it's sort of okay to do any of the things I just talked about, bribery, et cetera. And so a real desire to kind of like double down on these topics and making sure that employees have not misread the news to think that there's been a shift again in any of these policies. I haven't heard a silver bullet for this. It's not like, I think compliance professionals fully figured this out and said like, here's how you navigate it. But what I have kind of heard is like making sure that training, making sure communications are really consistent, because you can't control the message that an employee might be picking up on social media, in the news, whatever, but you can control kind of the consistent drumbeat that your own company has.
I think that's good advice. And I also think, to go back to one of the fundamental planks of a good ethics and compliance program, it's a great opportunity for tone at the top. And to remind people that the code of conduct is still in place. Actually, the FCPA is still in place. It hasn't been amended. And as I mentioned before, other types of enforcement are intensifying. It's not going away. So don't make assumptions that turn out to be wrong. And I think, fairly simple, straightforward recommitments to the code, to your code, and to following the law, I think are very appropriate in this circumstance. It's an opportunity too good to waste.
Agreed. I know we're getting kind of close to the Q&A and wrap-up time, so we can just hit on a couple more points and then kind of pause, and Ian, happy to turn it back over to you for any questions, et cetera. But I think the bottom line from the survey, and again, we have the full survey results accessible that I'm sure will be in a follow-up email or something, but is that we just saw in a bunch of different areas, I think that, compliance leaders were struggling to be able to have a very agile program because of challenges, often with vendors, sometimes with internal processes. Susan, you talked about the desire to sometimes bring things in-house, but the challenges that can come up with. And so kind of seeing that pretty consistently throughout. I think one area that for me has been a really exciting development of just good technology and then layered on with AI, so I'll just kind of plant the seed for any of you who want to follow up on this, is, we're sort of talking about compliance training as if it's one course, but of course, if you are a global company, you're then translating your content into, sometimes 20 plus languages. And I think it's been really exciting to see how good AI has gotten at solving this problem. Not flawless, but I'll say what we're seeing a lot is, and Athena did a live demo at this year's GES, where we recorded a very kind audience member at the beginning of training. He just said a couple of words, kind of essentially pretending as if he was the CEO, sort of kicking off code of conduct training. And then by the end of the demo, we had put that into code of conduct training and had dubbed it. So not just subtitles, but true dubbing into 20 plus languages that we could toggle. And so we, toggled it into Portuguese. And there were thankfully some folks from Brazil who said, oh, that's pretty good Portuguese. And you could toggle it to Mandarin. And it's pretty exciting, that you can do that literally instantly. We did it within, a 40-minute demo. And if your sort of flags are going off saying like, well, what about quality? How do I ensure that the exact same words that we use in Japan are flowing into our Japanese translation? You can, of course, put a human in the loop. So maybe your, compliance partner in Japan, for example, to make sure that that translation is of perfect quality. But I think that that's just like, to me, one of the most eye-opening examples of just how profound this like technological shift has been. That making custom training in English does not mean you then need to go make custom training in every language permutation. I don't know, Susan, if you have anything to add here, because I know you've personally lived this struggle.
Oh, for sure. And that is a major cost driver, Roxanne, for people who are buying from third-party vendors who haven't been able to use AI in the past. And so this should actually really help teams that are struggling on limited budgets, but nonetheless have employees abroad. And as part of making things employee-facing and making it easier for employees, this capability is really, especially, I know we'd help people use it as need be. It's really going to democratize the translations area. And I think that's a really good thing.
It's a great point. I asked at some point after the demo, I said, what do we charge for this? And they said, no, we just include it now because like the tech has just gotten so good. And so, yeah, I have certainly heard, a per language cost sometimes of content as just like quite, it would make it cost prohibitive to do frequent updating. And like, our perspective is, hey, the tech has gotten really good. Therefore, we should just be passing that on to our customers.
That's very good point. Yeah, because it is a major cost driver. And if we're going to include that, then that really does make it a lot easier for people to do the updates.
Exactly. And then, I think the consequences, we've kind of been hinting at them, but I do think it really matters. Like a relevant training to an employee who may already have a perception of compliance training as going to the DMV really reinforces for them that this isn't relevant. And I think it's kind of amazing how quickly employees can tune out of training. And what is unfortunate is if they tuned out at minute 5, but minute 7 was really important for them, like you may have lost them. I don't know if Susan, you have anything to add there.
Oh, I totally agree with that as well. And one of the things when you run a E&C program, in some regards, you become the company complaint department. And, people will complain if they're treated like it's the DMV, if the connection's bad, or, it takes multiple attempts to sign on, or worse yet, it crashes, or it delivers in the wrong language, which I've seen happen inadvertently. Again, you're really a customer service organization vis-a-vis the employees when you're in the E&C department, and making it as easy as possible and as accurate as possible is always a win-win.
Agreed. And sorry that, of course, we have an Amazon delivery happening at exactly this moment. It always has to work like that. Okay, so then we've kind of laid out the challenge of like what doesn't work. I think going beyond checking the box, really making things hyper tailored, and thinking a lot about your analytics that can tell you is the tweaks that you've made working. So, for example, if you move from peanut butter approach to role and risk-based training, something very simple you could do is both, of course, do your qualitative, like have conversations component, but you could also do a quantitative survey at the end. How did this compare to last year's training? Did you find it more effective? And even 1 or 2 questions for Ethena, we can slip them into the training so that it doesn't feel like a survey on top of that, can really give you an enlightened sense of what of how powerful those tweaks are.
Yeah, and that's also a great way to get feedback and even ask questions that can give you some real data on whether people are finding the training useful and whether it actually helps them do their job. And going back to the ECCP, which you talked about a while ago, Roxanne, that's really what the ECCP is about. It's taking it from check the box or stale pancakes. Sorry, couldn't resist, and making it relevant and something that employees really learn from.
Exactly right. And I think everyone will certainly, if nothing else, remember stale pancakes. Hopefully not associated with Athena.
Sorry about that.
So in terms of what we're seeing, we're really privileged to serve some of the most innovative companies, and what we see them do differently. A lot of these things we've already talked about, but I'll just maybe click in on the middle one, which is test out, which I talked about, but also adaptive learning. So that is kind of a slightly different tweak on test out, which might be based on how an employee is answering certain questions. You're giving them different training. You're giving them either more content, different content, more complex content, et cetera. And that can be really powerful. Another like kind of tweak on this that I've seen one of our customers do with a lot of success is they ask a question, something like, how likely are you to bring a concern to your compliance team? And then they identify the 5 essentially lowest scoring offices. And they take their in-person compliance time, right? Because you all typically are on quite lean teams. You don't have infinite time to go around the globe and do typically like live discussions, live Q&A, et cetera. And this particular customer focuses all of their live time on the hotspots, which I thought was just a really effective way to prioritize because, everything can't be a priority. So those are maybe like 2 things that I'll call out as, seeing some of our customers do.
Well, and one of the many things I like about our training is it really actively uses video. Now, that's like old news, right? But you'd be surprised at how many training, E&C trainings really don't do video and don't even really do animation. It's sort of voiceover PowerPoint. And it used to be that you'd then sort of do like a 2-minute video vignette to sort of, be engaging, but combining both. Employees are watching TikTok, so you can't compete directly with that, but you can at least make your training as engaging as you possibly can and as varied as you possibly can. And I love the point about humor and a certain amount of lightheartedness, including that as well.
I think, it's obviously can be a bit scary to dip your toe in that water. We had one customer who was very nervous. They had very light jokes in their training and they're like, I don't know, is this going to be such a shift from what we've done before? And they launched the training and both the GC and the chief people officer kind of immediately emailed and said, this has set a new standard for training. It was actually good because I think, Susan, to your point, you're competing with not just email, but Netflix and, all the other Amazon deliveries, like all the other distractions that your teams have. I know that we're like kind of over time. I see one question. So what I can do is call out something. We'll take this question and any others, and then Ian, I'll turn it back over to you. We haven't talked about scenario customization, but that's also where AI is getting really good. So just think if we take Susan and she's, in kind of a corporate setting, but without having to re-record, the tools are now getting good enough that it can look like Susan is now in more of a manufacturing environment. She's got a hard hat on and, the background has shifted. Now she's in a retail environment. And I think that can, that plus AI generated animations can really make it so if you have a very diverse team, you're able to create scenarios that aren't just different in substance, but also different in style. And that also sort of speaks for the employee, like, hey, I see myself in this training.
I volunteer, Roxanne. Happy to do it anytime.
I love the idea of just a little hard hat. So Susan, I'll let you take this one first. And then I'm also, kind of happy to jump in. So essentially the question is, what are we seeing in terms of how we can actually like measure effectiveness of better training? Like what are things that you might have looked for when you were in-house back in the day to say, cool, I sort of did all of the inputs that the ECCP, for example, is telling me, but how do I know it's actually worked?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad it's come up. In the past, and even now, people were way too focused on how many people they trained. And so if you brief the board every quarter, like I did, you duly went in and you said, we trained, 3,000 people in the last year. but that doesn't mean they learned anything. It's a bit like throwing flower seeds into your neighbor's garden and then thinking, hey, maybe they'll bloom. So being able to look at analytics and see where people struggle. And is that a particular demographic? Is that a particular area? Is that a particular country? And that's the ECCP calls that out as data analytics. And we provide that capacity to people. And I think if you've made that change where you're not just counting seat times, but you're looking at what's actually happening when people take the training, you'll never go back because you get a whole other layer of insight from that.
I think that's a great one. And I'll just maybe add that another area where we've seen folks look for efficacy is when they get a report brought up to a manager, compliance, et cetera. They'll ask why, what caused you to bring this forward? And sometimes they'll get an answer, hey, I didn't realize that I was supposed to be looking out for this thing. One thing that came up was like vendor behavior. And then I took my training and the scenario specifically called this out. And that's why I'm raising this. And of course, that's going to be a very low end, right? You're not going to have a ton of data from that on like a survey or something. However, it is very powerful anecdote or anecdata to see that. And then the other thing we see is something like asking every 6 months, every year, 1 or 2 questions where you're tracking knowledge over time. I'm more aware of our company's compliance officials. I'm more aware of the proper channels for reporting and, obviously looking for that number to go up over time, because otherwise, you would ask like, is our speak up training, for example, really having an impact if that number isn't moving? Ian, I see we're at time, so I'm happy to turn it over to you for the wrap up.
Thank you. And I was going to just add in one question that I thought might be interesting, which is, maybe you can talk about just how to keep training current with regulations and risks changing so quickly. I think a lot of people thought they understood how the world was going to be in October, and then it's changed November and December and January. And I think it's become one thing we hear from readers a lot over a compliance week is the sense that it's staying on top of this stuff is just really hard. So maybe you can share a little bit of how you're viewing that.
I can start that, Ian. And that gets to the heart of this whole webinar, which is about customization. And, as I say, the industry goes through phases where everybody takes it in-house and then outsources it. Well, you don't have to make that choice anymore because vendors like Ethena have these incredibly powerful tools and very nimble, agile ways of updating the training. I mean, I won't go to the pancakes, but there's no reason for it to go stale anymore. And especially with what this administration is doing, which could be described as hyperactive, being able to say, hey, we really have to be careful if we're doing an M&A transaction and we're moving large amounts of personal data to China. That's not even a privacy issue. That's now a national security issue.
Yeah.
Great point. Ian, I see we're over time, so I'm happy to let you wrap it up.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you all for joining, and also Roxanne and Susan for your perspective. Just a reminder that please disable your pop-up blockers to get the exam at the end when we finish this presentation. And that exam is going to show up in a separate window. If you have any problems, webcasts@complianceweek.com. I'm also going to make a quick little pitch for our events. We actually have one coming up next week that Roxanne and Susan will be at, our national conference, our 20th anniversary. We would love to have you there in Washington, D.C., but also we're going to have 2 really great events in Texas in June, focused on third-party risk management and then also women in compliance. And it doesn't just have to be about women, but it is very much about community. Also, one last little thing. You can become a member of Compliance Week. We actually have a special deal that we offer webcast listeners. So we actually are recording this and we're going to have access to it for you through our website. So if you want to access it or get access to the slides or whatever else, or some of the data, becoming a member is a really easy way to do that. So I just want to remind you all about that. So that concludes our webcast. Thank you all for joining us, and good luck with your exam, and have a wonderful rest of your day.